Welcome to the fourth segment of A Journey Through Assyrian History. Who are the Assyrians of today? Now, people know the ancient Assyrians, but not so much the Assyrians of today. We need to step back and understand the divisions among the Assyrians that have caused much confusion among those who have observed the Assyrians and even among the Assyrians themselves. The Assyrians are an Aramaic-speaking Christian group from northern Mesopotamia, or Assyria, today divided into Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. In religious terms, they may be divided and categorized into two main denominational and linguistic groupings. The first is the East Syrians or Eastern Syriacs, members of the Church of the East, who are called the Nestorians, and we will get into all of these terms later, the Nestorians and their unate brethren, the Chaldeans, and the West Syrians or Syriacs, members of the Syriac Orthodox Church or the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch, and their offshoots, the Syriac Catholics or Syrian Catholics. Now, the word Syrian comes from Assyrian. Syriac, which is derived from the word Syrian, is really a linguistic term, often used for a script, but I'm using it here to simplify the various groupings. In addition to the West Syrians and the East Syrians that we discussed, or the West Syriacs and the Eastern Syriacs, there are smaller clusters of Catholics and Protestants who converted from the churches, the Eastern Syrian and Western Syrian churches, late in the 18th or 19th centuries due to Western missionary activity. The Maronite Church of Lebanon, which is a unate church affiliated with Rome, is an offshoot from the Syrian Church, or the Western Syrian Church, and possesses a liturgy which is almost indistinguishable from the Syriac Orthodox Church or Syriac Catholic Church, but really is outside of the scope of this study. In the early Christian centuries, all of the above churches roughly belonged to one entity whose hierarch was stationed in Antioch, in what was Greek-dominated Syria or Byzantine-dominated Syria. This was generally true until the split with the Christians living in the Sasanian Empire, a division that was fostered by Byzantine and Sasanian antagonisms and accentuated with the rise of the Church of the East among, in particular, Assyrians in Mesopotamia. This left an unbridgeable divide between the Christians living in present-day Syria and those in Mesopotamia because of the border between the Sasanians and the Byzantines. The Christians in Mesopotamia came to be known as Nestorians, or followers of Nestorus, which we will go into in a couple of minutes, and East Syrians. And the former, the people living in west of the Euphrates, came to be known as West Syrians, or the Syriac Orthodox, or the Jacobites. Now, the roots of the theological split may be traced back to the councils of the early Christian leaders who gathered to address the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, in Christianity. And this was in Nicaea in 325 AD. Now, these prelates, without the presence of the Assyrian Christians from the Sasanian Empire, established that the Son was, quote, from the ousia, or substance, of the Father, and of the same substance with the Father. This countered and abolished the teachings of the priest Arius, who taught that only the Father in the Christian Trinity was true God, and that the Son was lesser and not of the same substance as the true God or the Father. As soon as the teachings of Arius were entirely rejected by all sides, the query regarding the relationship of the godly nature with the human element in Jesus Christ, arose. Generally, two schools of thought addressed this issue: the school of Antioch in the east and that of Alexandria in northern Egypt. Whereas the school of Alexandria concerned itself more with theology, the school of Antioch emphasized historical data. This was all concerning the person of Christ. Nestorius, a 5th century Byzantine bishop of Constantinople, whose ethnic origins are not clear, whether he was Greek or Assyrian or something else, adhered to a Christological doctrine that originated in the Antiochian school, the school of Antioch, and developed substantially by two figures, Diodorus of Tarsus and his pupil Theodore of Mopsuestia. Little is known of Diodorus, but the teachings of Theodore show that it was he who gave the basic form to the teachings of Nestorius. Theodore taught that for the sake of humanity, Jesus suffered as a human, that Jesus had a complete humanity as well as divinity, and that this did not lead to two Christs, but a union of human and divine, the indwelling of the Word, quote unquote. Thus, according to him, there results neither any confusion of the natures nor any untenable division of the person, for our account of the natures must remain unconfused, and the person must be recognized as indivisible. This again related to Christ. What we're talking about here is Christology. Underlying the theological conflict were the tensions and the power struggles between these great powers, the Sasanians on the one hand in the east and the Byzantines on the other hand in the west. When friction between these two forces increased, the Persians or the Sasanians suspected the Christians within their realm, the Church of the East members, of becoming sympathizers or agents of the Byzantines. Thus, even before the Christological controversies began, Christians in Sasanian-dominated Mesopotamia found it beneficial to sever their administrative ties with their Byzantine co-religionists in Syria by electing a Catholicos, a position below the Patriarch but above the Metropolitan, in order to gain favor of their anti-Byzantine Sasanian government. After Nestorius was declared a heretic and condemned by a consensus of Western religious and secular leaders, many of his followers and sympathizers who were in the West, persecuted by the Byzantines, found refuge among the Christians in Mesopotamia and in Persia, whose rulers found it politically expedient to tolerate and protect them. Thus, Christians who remained in the Byzantine Empire, where the city of Antioch was situated, and had chosen or were coerced to condemn Nestorius and to separate themselves from him and from his teachings as heretical teachings, became attached to what we have come to later know as the Syriac Orthodox Church or the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch. Only one generation after the condemnation of Nestorius by Western prelates, the Syrian or Syriac Orthodox Church followed Monophysitism, a view to the extreme of Nestorianism, virtually denying the humanity of Christ. Remember now, these are one people sharing a culture, sharing a linguistic tradition, sharing a liturgical tradition, but they are now on extreme ends of the Christological spectrum. The adherents of this view, led by Dioscorus, Patriarch of Alexandria, in 444 AD, persuaded Theodosius II, the dying Byzantine emperor, to hold a second Ephesian council in 449. Remember, the Council of Nicaea was in 325 AD. Now comes another council, known as, quote, the Robber Council of Ephesus, end of quote, during which bishops were bribed and physically forced to comply with Monophysitism. It was eventually condemned, as was Dioscorus, by the new emperor Marcian. Yet despite this condemnation, the Monophysites thrived in the area of Syria and Egypt. Now, the Syrian Orthodox Church was and is also known as the Jacobite Church, so named after Yaqub bar Addai, circa 500 AD, Jacob Bardeos, an early pillar of the Syrian Orthodox Church. The Syrian Orthodox Church carried on its activities mostly in the area of what is today Syria and northern Mesopotamia, also Assyria. It was thus geographically limited, unlike the Church of the East, to these two regions. Now, the Church of the East, or what came to be known as the Nestorian Church, erroneously, converted to its fold Persians, Arabs, Indians, Tatars, Mongols, Chinese, and a host of other peoples. At the time of the Islamic conquest of the Fertile Crescent, there was no other significant church contending with the Church of the East for Christian theological hegemony in all of Asia. The Muslim conquest of the Fertile Crescent in effect saved the Middle Eastern heretical churches, both the Nestorians and the Monophysites, from the persecutions of the Byzantines. Like the Persian rulers or the Sasanian rulers before them, the Arabs found it advantageous to have Christians within their realm that are at odds with the Roman or Byzantines. The heart of the Christians rejoiced over the domination of the Arabs. May God strengthen and prosper it, wrote one Christian chronicler some centuries after the Islamic conquest. And this was because of what was endured by both the Byzantines and the Sasanians before the coming of the Arabs. Of course, later chroniclers would paint a different picture because they would show that there was persecution by the Arabs of the various Christian churches, though considered heretical by the Western powers. The new conquerors also discovered early as to the invaluable services of Christians rendered to society as artisans, physicians, merchants, scholars, and tax collectors, and treated them well in most cases in good times. Nestorians and Jacobites, Assyrians, were granted civil recognition, which the Byzantines had not granted them, a step that allowed for the establishment of numerous churches and monasteries in both Syria and Assyria, or Mesopotamia, and the subsequent development of culture and traditions increasingly foreign to the Byzantines. Remember now, there is a separation between the Assyrians living under Byzantines and the Assyrians living under Arab domination, just as there was earlier when the Assyrians were living under Sasanians as well as under the Byzantines. During the conversion of the Crusades, beginning in the 11th century, the stability of Christian and Muslim relations was disrupted, leaving behind a, quote, legacy of mistrust and antagonism that would be revived in modern times, end of quote, according to historian John Joseph. However, unlike certain groups who had formed military alliances with the Crusades, the Assyrians, Jacobites, and Nestorians did not form military alliances with the Crusades, and so they suffered less than other Christian groups as a result of the Crusade intrusion into the Middle East. Nevertheless, their socio-political position suffered after the incursion of the Crusades. Inter-Christian rivalries, periodic persecutions by Muslim rulers, and finally the Mongol invasion of Timor in particular devastated the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox churches. Timur's massacres and pillages of all that was Christian reduced the religion and the church into an almost irrelevant state in the Middle East. At the end of the reign of Timur, the Church of the East had almost been eradicated. In two locations, however, it survived. In the provinces of Assyria, or northern Mesopotamia, which had retained its Christian name, the districts of Beth Germe, Adiaben, Arbil, Kelech Besiluk, which is Kirkuk, Nuhadra, which is Duhok, known as Duhok, Nineveh, Mosul, etc., where the church had acquired much of its nourishment in the past, and in the Hakkari Mountains of the Ottoman Kurdistan, or Ottoman Kurdistan, where the Assyrian members of the Church of the East lived almost an isolated existence until being evicted by the Kurds and the Turks from that area during the First World War. It thrived. Additionally, a meager number of members of the Church of the East, also Nestorians or Indians, survived in southern India. The rest of the denominations or the parishes of the Church of the East had disappeared all over Asia. Toward the end of the 13th century, the Jacobite Barhabreus found, quote, much quietness, end of quote, in his diocese in Mesopotamia. Syria's diocese, he wrote, was wasted. This after, of course, Timur's conquest. We can gather from the experiences of the Christian denominations of the Assyrians that by the time of the split within the Church of the East in the 1500s, there was much damage done, probably irretrievably so, to the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church, so that Christianity in Asia as a whole had come to suffer significantly. In 1553, the Church of the East met more misfortune in the form of a split that eventually left one side under the Roman Catholic denomination, the Chaldean Church. Over a period of 4 centuries, the Catholic side of the Church of the East, the Chaldean Church, as it came to be known, eventually grew to outnumber its parent church, the Church of the East, and formed as a separate millet under the Ottoman Porte. In Iraq today, the Assyrian Chaldeans outnumber the Assyrian members of the Church of the East, roughly 2-1 or 3-1. Among the Syriac Orthodox Church, there was also a split that resulted in Roman domination as well. Unlike in the Church of the East side, the Catholics among the Syriac Orthodox Church remain relatively small compared to their parent church. Now that we've come to know the Assyrian religious groups, the next time we will focus on the discovery of nationalism and what led to it among the Assyrians in the 19th century. Once we understand the growth of nationalism and the perception of the past among the Assyrians, we will delve into the very ancient past of the Assyrians. See you next time. Good having you.